It was 1983. I remember the icy grip on the steering wheel and the static-filled radio struggling to maintain signal as we drove deeper into the forest. Marcos, my best friend since high school, sat next to me, joking about how we should have taken a better route for our short expedition. It was typical of him to try to lighten the mood, even when things weren't going well. I laughed along, but felt a sense of unease. We had heard rumors about a hidden lake somewhere in these woods, which the locals believed would be untouched and of wonderful beauty if found. The main goal was to get off the beaten path and away from the noise of the city. Marcos always had that spirit, you know? He made every trip seem like a movie adventure, as we have always been addicted to movies of that genre. We packed light, bringing only food, water, a flashlight, and a map that was more of a suggestion than anything useful. We weren't worried because we had done this before. We believed we had done it. The road eventually changed from gravel to something much rougher, almost as if it hadn't been treated in years. The tires kicked up rocks, so I had to slow down and grip the steering wheel tighter. Marcos reached into the glove compartment and pulled out a small knife. "Just in case," he replied with a smile. But I could see the look in his eyes. It wasn't terror exactly. He probably felt tension too, but he'd never admit it. That's the problem with friends like him. They don't want you to worry. They want you to believe that everything will be okay, even when it isn't. Then something happened. A deer, or possibly something else, jumped in front of the car, its eyes glowing for a split second before I swerved. The tires screeched and we slid off the trail. The impact was sudden, with metal crunching and glass shattering. When we finally stopped, we heard nothing more. I stared, puzzled by the taste of copper in my mouth. "Marcos, are you okay?" I asked, my voice buzzing. He sighed and rubbed his forehead where he'd hit the dashboard. Yeah, I guess so." We climbed out of the wreckage and inspected the damage. The front of the car was crumpled and steam hissed from the engine. "Great," he muttered. "We're trapped." We looked around, trying to get our bearings, but everything was the same. Trees, shadows, and that unsettling silence. We didn't have many options but to start walking. The map was useless, crumpled in Marcos's fingers, so we chose a path and went. We joked that we'd probably end up on the news as two idiots trapped in the woods. It was easier to laugh than to express our fear. But as the hours went, the jungle seemed to stretch on indefinitely, and the route vanished into nothing. Marcos would occasionally stop and listen. "Did you hear that?" he would ask, and I'd simply shake my head. Perhaps it was the wind or our nerves playing tricks on us. When we finally saw light through the trees, I felt a sense of relief. It was a house, a little wooden structure barely visible through the foliage. Marcos poked me while grinning. "See? I told you we'd find something." We approached the porch, and he knocked. The door cracked open, and an elderly guy peered out. His gaze shifted between us, taking in the cuts on our faces and the grime on our clothing. "Car trouble?" he questioned, his voice harsh as gravel. Marcos nodded. "Yeah, we could use some help." The man opened the door wider and motioned us inside. The warmth of the fire touched my skin, and for a moment, I thought everything would be well. We were safe. We had discovered help. The room was small, crammed with antique furniture and knickknacks you'd expect to see in your grandparents' house, ceramic figurines, dusty books, and blankets draped over old chairs. Marcos relaxed almost instantly, reaching his hands toward the fire. But I kept my gaze on the man. Something about his expression was off. He seemed to be watching us very carefully, analyzing every move we made. He introduced himself as Bill, and a woman, presumably his wife, appeared from a back room with a tray containing 2 mugs. "You guys must be freezing," she replied with a smile that seemed a little too big and eager. She handed us the mugs, and Marcos, as always, did so without hesitation. He took a sip and nodded appreciatively. I hesitated, steam rising to my face. It smelled like herbal tea, but I didn't trust them yet. I took a small sip, just to be polite. Bill started asking questions, where we were from, what brought us out this way. Marcos did most of the talking, explaining how we were looking for that lake we'd heard about. Bill's eyes narrowed, like he was trying to remember something. "Not many folks come through here anymore," he said, his voice almost a murmur. "These woods, they're not like they used to be." I glanced at Marcos, but he just laughed it off, asking if they had a phone we could use. Bill's smile faded. Phone line's been down for weeks. That should have been my cue. I should have insisted we leave, maybe find a different route. But then the woman, the one who hadn't given us her name, spoke up again. "Why don't you boys stay for dinner? It's not often we get visitors." She disappeared into the kitchen without waiting for an answer, and I felt Marcos nudge my arm. "See? Told you it'd work out." I tried to smile, but I couldn't shake the itch in my mind that something was off. As we waited, I scanned the room. The walls were lined with animal heads, deer, boar, even a bear. They were all mounted, staring down at us with glassy eyes. Bill caught me looking. "I hunt," he explained. "Most of what we eat comes from these woods." His eyes didn't leave mine as he said it, and I felt a chill despite the fire. I forced a nod, trying to seem relaxed, but inside, I felt like a rabbit caught in a trap. Marcos was busy making small talk, joking about city life and asking Bill about the best spots for hunting. I watched the old man's expression shift. His eyes softened, almost like he was remembering something from long ago. "There's a place deeper in," he started, but then his wife returned, placing plates on the table. The smell hit me immediately, rich, savory, but with an undertone that I couldn't place. We sat down to eat. Marcos dug in right away, complimenting the woman's cooking, but I poked at my plate. The meat was tender, but there was a taste that lingered, something metallic, almost sour. I forced a few bites, enough to seem polite. "You don't like it?" the woman asked, her eyes locking onto mine. I swallowed hard, managing a smile. "It's good, just not what I'm used to." The rest of the meal passed in awkward conversation. Bill and his wife watched us closely, too closely, like they were waiting for something. I glanced at Marcos, who seemed completely at ease, but I couldn't match his calm. My eyes drifted to a door at the back of the room, one I hadn't noticed before. It was shut tight, and something about it felt wrong, like it didn't belong there. After dinner, Bill offered us a place to sleep for the night. Marcos was all in, thanking them for their generosity. But I hesitated. "I think we should keep moving," I whispered to him when Bill and his wife stepped out. "Something doesn't feel right." Marcos rolled his eyes, brushing me off. "You're always so paranoid, man. We're lucky we found them." That's when I heard it, a faint noise coming from behind that closed door. It was quick, just a brief thump, like something or someone had moved. I turned, staring at the door, but it was silent again. When Bill returned, I forced a smile, pretending everything was fine. But in my gut, I knew it wasn't. Something was hiding in that house. That night, after dinner, Bill showed us to a small room at the end of the hall. The walls were thin, and the wooden floor creaked with every step. There were 2 single beds, old and covered in blankets that smelled faintly of dust. Marcos dropped his backpack and flopped down, stretching out like he'd finally found comfort. "Told you, man. These folks are harmless," he said, pulling the blanket over himself. I gave him a nod, but inside, every instinct was on edge. I sat down on the bed across from him, listening to the distant sounds of the house settling. As Marcos drifted off, I lay there, staring up at the ceiling. My mind replayed the events of the evening, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It wasn't just the way Bill and his wife looked at us, it was everything. The locked door, the strange noises. I told myself it was paranoia, but deep down, I knew better. I've always trusted my gut, and it was screaming at me. Hours passed. The room was dark except for a sliver of moonlight sneaking through the curtain. At some point, I must have drifted off, but a sharp sound jolted me awake. I sat up, heart racing, and glanced over at Marcos. He was still out cold, snoring softly. I waited, holding my breath, trying to listen past the pounding in my chest. There it was again, a muffled thump, this time closer. It was coming from the hallway, from somewhere near that locked door. Slowly, I slipped out of bed, careful not to make a sound. My bare feet pressed against the cold floor as I crept towards the door. I opened it just enough to peek through the crack. The hall was dim, shadows stretching long and unnatural under the flicker of a single bulb. The door at the end was slightly ajar now, a thin line of darkness where there should have been none. I watched, waiting for some sign of movement, but all I saw was the stillness of the hallway. I thought about waking Marcos, but a part of me held back. I didn't want to look like the paranoid one again. I took a deep breath and stepped out, moving as quietly as I could. The floor groaned beneath my weight, but I pressed on, inching closer to the door. When I reached it, I paused, ear pressed against the wood. There was a sound, low, like a whisper or a breath. I felt my pulse quicken. What was behind that door? I reached for the handle, my fingers hesitating over the cold metal. Something in my head told me to turn back, to wake Marcos, and get out of there. But curiosity and fear pushed me forward. I twisted the knob, feeling the door give way. It creaked open, and I peered into the darkness beyond. The smell hit me first, damp, metallic, and something else, something like rotting wood. Inside, there were shelves stacked with jars, filled with what looked like preserves, but the labels were too faded to read. I squinted, trying to make out the contents when a figure moved in the corner of my eye. My heart jumped into my throat as I spun around. Nothing, just shadows. I exhaled, backing up slowly. Maybe it was my mind playing tricks, or maybe it was the exhaustion. Just as I turned to leave, I heard a voice, low, almost from the back of the room. "Help! Me." My blood ran cold. I wanted to run, but my legs felt glued to the spot. I strained my eyes, and there, in the far corner, I saw movement, a hand, pale and shaking, reaching out from behind a pile of old blankets. I froze, my brain trying to process what I was seeing. The blankets shifted, and a face appeared, thin, with eyes wide, full of fear. "Please, they're not who they say they are." The words barely made it out, weak and raspy. My mind raced. Who was this person? Why were they locked in here? I took a step forward, and that's when I heard footsteps behind me, heavy and slow. I turned, and there was Bill, standing in the doorway. His eyes fixed on me, unblinking, and for the first time I saw the look in them clearly. It wasn't concern or confusion, it was something darker, something like hunger. "What are you doing in here?" he asked, his voice cold. I opened my mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come. Behind him I could see his wife, her face half hidden in shadow. She was holding something, a knife, long and rusted. "It's not safe to wander at night," she said, her tone almost casual. "Things get lost." I didn't have time to think. The look in Bill's eyes was enough to tell me I'd crossed a line. My heart pounded in my chest as I took a step back, trying to put distance between us. The woman's grip on that knife tightened, her knuckles white against the handle. "You shouldn't be here," Bill muttered, his voice cold and flat. The warmth from earlier, that forced hospitality, was gone. All that was left was the cold reality of the situation. I was somewhere I didn't belong, and they knew it. Marcos. I had to get to him. I turned, ready to bolt back to our room, but Bill grabbed my arm, his fingers digging into my skin. "We don't like wanderers in these parts," he said through gritted teeth. I yanked my arm free, my eyes darting to the door. The person inside, the one who had whispered for help, was completely silent now, as if they'd vanished into thin air. "Let go!" I shouted, louder than I meant to, and for a split second, I saw hesitation in Bill's eyes. I shoved past him, sprinting down the hallway, my feet slamming against the wood. Every instinct in me screamed to get out, but I couldn't leave without Marcos. I burst into our room, slamming the door behind me. "Marcos, wake up!" I hissed, grabbing his shoulder and shaking him hard. He groaned, still half asleep, and I could see he had no idea what was happening. "We have to go, now!" He sat up, rubbing his eyes. "What's going on? Why are you freaking out?" His voice was groggy, and I could feel the frustration bubbling up. I pulled him out of bed, practically dragging him to his feet. "They're not what they seem, Marcos. We have to leave right now." The urgency in my voice must have finally gotten through to him, because his eyes sharpened, and he nodded, though confusion still clouded his face. We moved quickly, grabbing our bags and heading for the door. But as soon as we stepped into the hallway, Bill and his wife were there, blocking the exit. Her face was calm, too calm, as she held the knife low at her side. "Leaving so soon?" she asked, tilting her head. "We thought you boys could use a good night's rest." Bill's hand rested on the doorframe, and I knew there was no getting past them without a fight. I glanced at Marcos, and I could see the panic setting in. "We, appreciate the hospitality, but we really need to get back on the road," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Bill's eyes flicked between us, and for a moment, I thought he might let us go. But then his wife stepped forward, her eyes narrowing. "You've been snooping where you shouldn't," she said, and there was no warmth left in her voice. Just that same coldness. Marcos shifted beside me, and I knew what he was thinking. We couldn't just stand there. Run, I yelled, shoving him towards the door. We pushed past them, and I felt her knife slice the air, missing me by inches. We stumbled into the living room, our footsteps pounding like thunder. I could hear them behind us, their voices turning into angry shouts. We had to get outside, get to the woods, anything to put distance between us and them. We crashed through the front door, into the cold night air. Marcos was ahead of me, sprinting towards the tree line. I didn't dare look back, but I could hear them, close enough to make my skin crawl. Don't let them get away. Bill's voice rang out, and it was filled with a rage that sent chills down my spine. We tore through the brush, branches slashing at our faces, our breath coming in ragged gasps. Marcos stumbled, and I grabbed his arm, pulling him back up. Come on, don't stop, I urged, but every part of me knew they were closing in. The forest was a maze, and in the darkness, everything looked the same. We could have been running in circles for all I knew. I pushed the thought out of my mind, focusing on the sound of our footsteps and the shadows ahead. We broke through a thicket and came upon a clearing. For a second, I thought it might be a way out, but all I saw were more trees, stretching endlessly. Marcos looked at me, fear written all over his face. What do we do? He whispered, and I had no answer. We were trapped out here, with no sense of direction and nowhere to hide. The only thing we could do was keep moving, hoping we'd lose them in the dark. And then, somewhere behind us, I heard it, a rustle of leaves, the crack of a twig. They were out there, hunting us. We ran until our lungs burned. The shadows of the trees twisted around us, and every step felt like a trap. I could hear Marcos's breath growing ragged beside me, each gasp louder than the last. We have to hide, I whispered, pulling him to the side as we ducked behind a cluster of bushes. We crouched there, the night swallowing us up, our backs pressed against the cold earth. My mind raced, searching for options. I knew we couldn't outrun them forever. I strained to hear anything over my own heartbeat. Then, footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving through the brush. They were close. I could see the flicker of a flashlight cutting through the trees, sweeping back and forth, hunting. Marcos looked at me, his eyes wide, and I placed a finger to my lips, praying he'd stay quiet. The beam of light passed over us, just inches away, and I held my breath, every muscle locked. They paused, so close I could almost feel their presence, and for a moment, I thought they'd spotted us. But then the light shifted, and the footsteps moved away. I exhaled, feeling a brief moment of relief, but I knew it wouldn't last. We had to keep moving. I nodded to Marcos, and we slipped further into the trees, crawling low, our movements slow and careful. As we pushed forward, I spotted a small shed, half hidden by vines and moss, like it had been abandoned for years. I motioned for Marcos to follow, and we made our way toward it, keeping our heads down. We needed a place to regroup, to figure out our next move. The door creaked as I pushed it open, and the smell of damp wood hit me. Inside, there was barely enough room to stand, but it was shelter. Marcos slumped against the wall, rubbing his forehead. "What the hell, man? Who are these people?" he whispered, his voice shaky. I didn't have an answer. "I don't know, but we can't stay here long." My eyes scanned the shed, looking for anything we could use. A tool, a weapon, anything. Then I saw it, scratches along the inside of the door, deep, desperate gouges, like someone had tried to claw their way out. My stomach twisted, and I backed away, nearly stumbling into Marcos. "This isn't right," I muttered, my voice barely above a whisper. "We need to get out of here." But as I turned, the sound of footsteps approached again, faster this time, closing in. Someone banged on the door, hard. "We know you're in there," a voice shouted. It wasn't Bill's. It was deeper, more aggressive. Panic surged through me. I grabbed Marcos's arm. "Out the back now!" We shoved open the rear window, and I climbed through, pulling him after me. We hit the ground running, diving into the undergrowth. The voices behind us grew louder, and I knew they wouldn't stop until they found us. The realization hit me like a punch. This wasn't just about getting lost anymore. We were prey, and they were hunting us. We stumbled onto a narrow path that cut through the forest. "This way," I hissed, dragging Marcos along. The path felt like our only chance, but every step forward felt like a step deeper into their territory. We pushed through, branches tearing at our clothes, until we reached a clearing. In the center stood an old, rusted trapdoor, half hidden by overgrown weeds. It looked ancient, like it hadn't been opened in decades. But something about it felt like a last resort. Marcos hesitated. "Man, are you sure?" he asked, eyeing the door. I didn't have time to think. "We don't have a choice." I grabbed the handle and pulled with everything I had. The door groaned, and a stale, cold air rose from below. We dropped in, landing on the dirt floor of an underground tunnel. I pulled the door shut above us, plunging us into darkness. The only light came from the dim glow of Marcos's flashlight as he fumbled to turn it on. The tunnel stretched out, narrow and suffocating, like it had been carved out long ago. "What is this place?" Marcos muttered, his voice echoing softly. We crept forward, my heart pounding louder than ever. The air felt thick, like it was pressing in from all sides. Just as we rounded a corner, the flashlight flickered, and the walls around us came into view, lined with old photos, dozens of them, pinned to the earth like a twisted gallery. I squinted, my eyes adjusting, and felt a cold shiver run down my spine. The faces in those photos, they weren't strangers. They were people I recognized, locals from the area, travelers who had gone missing. And then, right there in the middle, was a picture of us. Me and Marcos from earlier that night, standing at the front door of Bill's cabin. I staggered back, my mind racing. "They've been watching us," I whispered, my voice cracking. Marcos stared at the photo, his face pale. This was a setup. They knew we'd come. We weren't just unlucky hikers who'd stumbled into the wrong place. We were chosen. I remember it clearly, 2015, and I was restless. I'd been hiking for years, nothing too extreme, but I liked finding new places, trails nobody talked about. That sense of discovery, of stepping into the unknown, it pulls you in. So I set my sights on Pisgah National Forest, a place with miles of dense woods. It's the kind of area that can swallow you whole if you're not careful. I'd heard stories, but I figured they were just local rumors. People love to make up things about old forests. I had my gear ready, maps, compass, the works. But halfway through my hike, I stumbled onto a path that wasn't marked. It was narrow, barely a trail, really, more like a stretch where the trees just happened to part. Something in me said, "Take it." Looking back, maybe it was curiosity, maybe it was something else, but I stepped off the main road. The deeper I went, the more the forest seemed to close in. It felt like the trees were crowding, leaning just a little closer. And then I saw it. A cabin. Right there, tucked between the trees like it had always been there. This place looked old, but not in the way you'd expect something abandoned to look. The wood wasn't rotting, the windows weren't shattered, and there were no vines crawling up the sides. If anything, it seemed almost preserved. I hesitated. Who wouldn't? But there was something about it, like I was meant to find it. I pushed the door, and it creaked open. Inside, the light was dim, filtering through thick curtains. Dust covered everything, chairs, an old table, some books stacked in the corner. But the weird thing, there were ashes in the fireplace, fresh ones, like someone had just been there. I walked around, checking every corner. There was this smell, wood, smoke, and something else I couldn't place. It wasn't foul, but it wasn't exactly comforting either. I started flipping through the books, all of them in a language I didn't recognize. I thought about taking one as a kind of souvenir, but something held me back. I figured maybe it was just the creepiness of the whole scene. Still, I was far from any town, and the light outside was fading fast. I made the call to stay for the night. The air outside got colder, the forest went quiet, and I set up my sleeping bag in front of the fireplace. I tried to relax, but my mind kept going back to those ashes. Who had been there, and how long ago? It didn't make sense. I brushed it off, telling myself I was overthinking it. But deep down, there was this feeling, like I wasn't as alone as I thought. I put out the fire and tried to sleep, figuring the sooner morning came, the better. Sometime later, hours maybe, I heard it. It was faint at first, like a murmur carried by the wind, but it grew louder. Footsteps, heavy ones, crunching the leaves outside. My heart pounded. I reached for my flashlight, creeping up to the window. I saw nothing, just darkness. The sounds continued, circling the cabin, slow and deliberate. I held my breath, gripping the flashlight tighter. And then, the footsteps stopped. I don't know how long I stood there, waiting for something to happen. I tried to convince myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer. But then came the knock, loud and firm, like a fist pounding against the wood. I felt the floor vibrate with each thud. I wanted to call out, but the words stuck in my throat. I forced myself to move, reaching for the door. When I swung it open, the cold air hit me, and nothing. No one. Just the forest staring back. I looked down and saw them, footprints in the mud. They were deep, way deeper than they should have been, and they led off into the trees. I scanned the tree line with my flashlight, trying to see if someone was out there watching. The wind rustled the leaves, but there was no movement. My instincts screamed to shut the door, lock it, and wait until sunrise. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat by the window, flashlight in hand, eyes scanning the dark. Every little noise set me on edge. A twig snapping, leaves shifting. It was like the forest was alive, and it was waiting. By the time dawn broke, I was exhausted, but relief washed over me. I grabbed my stuff, ready to leave that place behind. But when I stepped out, I froze. The cabin, it was gone. I spun around, my eyes darting between the trees. The space where it had been was empty, just grass and mud. And there in the distance, the trail I'd come in on was back, as if nothing had changed. I didn't wait. I ran, not looking back once. When I made it back to the main trail, I felt a rush of relief, but it was mixed with something else. Confusion, mostly. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see the cabin reappear, but it was like it had never existed in the first place. The trail was clear, the same as when I had first walked it, and there was no sign of the clearing where the cabin had been. It was unsettling, like the forest was playing tricks on me. I hiked back faster than I'd ever moved before. The path felt longer, like it was stretching, but I pushed on. Every once in a while, I'd hear something, a branch snapping, a distant rustle. I'd whip around trying to catch sight of whatever was making the noise, but the trees just stared back unmoving. It was like I was being watched, but there was no one there. I remember gripping my pack so tight, my knuckles turned white. It was late afternoon when I finally saw the parking lot, and I can't tell you the relief that hit me. My car was right where I left it, like a beacon of normalcy. I practically jogged the last stretch, but as I reached for the door handle, I noticed something odd. Mud. Thick, wet mud smeared on the driver's side, like someone had dragged their hand across it. I hadn't parked anywhere near mud, and I knew it wasn't there when I started the hike. I stood there, staring at the mark, my mind racing through explanations. Maybe it was some animal brushing past, or another hiker playing a prank, but none of it made sense. My instinct told me to leave, to just get out of there, so I climbed in, locked the doors, and started the engine. As I pulled onto the road, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something standing at the edge of the forest. Nothing. Just trees. Driving away, I kept thinking about that trail, how it seemed to vanish and reappear like a mirage. I tried convincing myself that maybe I'd just gotten turned around, that I was tired, and my mind was playing tricks. But the cabin, those footprints, they felt too real. The more I thought about it, the more uneasy I became. It was like something wanted me to find that place. But why? I didn't sleep well that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw flashes of the cabin, the books, the fireplace, the empty doorway. I'd wake up, heart pounding, and check the window like I expected to see something out there, staring back at me. I told myself I was overreacting, that it was just a weird experience in the woods. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. The next morning, I tried looking up anything I could find about the area. Old stories, abandoned cabins, anything that might explain what I'd seen. But there was nothing. No record of a cabin matching what I described. No reports of strange happenings in that part of the forest. It was like the place had been wiped from existence. I even went through some old forums, hoping someone else might have seen the same thing, but I came up empty. A few days later, I noticed something odd. I was in the kitchen, making coffee, when I glanced at my phone. There was a picture on the screen, one I hadn't taken. It was a blurry shot of trees, a path winding between them. My blood went cold. It was the trail I'd taken that day, the unmarked one. I swiped through my camera roll, and there were more, photos of the cabin, the books, even the fireplace with the fresh ashes, all from angles I didn't remember standing at. I couldn't explain it. I hadn't pulled my phone out once while I was there. I hadn't taken any pictures. It felt like proof. But proof of what? That I'd been there, or that something else had been watching me. I deleted the photos, every single one, but the unease didn't go away. It was like the forest had followed me home. I tried telling a friend about it, just to see if saying it out loud would make it sound less crazy. But as I spoke, I could see the skepticism in his eyes. "Are you sure you didn't just dream it?" he asked, laughing it off. I forced a smile, shrugged it off, but inside, I felt this nagging doubt. I hadn't imagined it. I knew that much. But then a few nights later, I woke up to a sound, one I recognized immediately. It was the same knock, the same pattern, just like the one at the cabin door. Only this time, it was coming from my front door. I lay there, frozen, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing back to that night in the woods. The knock came again, loud, deliberate, waiting for me to respond. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, my heart pounding in my chest. The knock came again, steady and deliberate, just like it had in the woods. I felt every instinct in me screaming to stay put, to ignore it. I tried convincing myself it was just a late-night prank, but deep down, I knew. It was the same pattern, the same rhythm. Someone or something wanted me to answer. Slowly, I got out of bed, trying to move as quietly as possible. I didn't want whoever or whatever was outside to know I was awake. The floor creaked under my weight, and I winced, holding my breath for a moment. I crept to the door, my hand hovering over the doorknob, feeling the cold metal against my skin. I could hear my own breathing, steady but shallow. It felt like time had stretched, every second longer than the last. I pressed my eye against the peephole, expecting darkness. Instead, I saw nothing, just empty space. I exhaled, the smallest hint of relief creeping in. But then, as I started to step back, I caught it, a shadow moving at the edge of my vision. It was quick, almost like it was playing with me, staying just out of sight. I pulled back, my pulse quickening again. What was out there? I whispered to myself, "Just open it. It's probably nothing." But I knew I wasn't convinced. My hand shook as I unlocked the door. I hesitated, my mind flashing back to the cabin and those deep footprints. The door creaked open and I braced myself, expecting the worst. But when I looked out, the hallway was empty. The only thing there was a trail of wet footprints leading away from my door. They were fresh, like someone had been standing there just moments before. I stood frozen, staring down the hallway. Each step seemed to disappear into the shadows, fading before they reached the stairwell. I stepped back inside, locking the door and sliding the chain into place. It was then that I noticed my hands were trembling. I forced myself to breathe, to think rationally, but nothing about this was rational. The woods, the cabin, the knocking, it was all connected somehow, and I couldn't shake that feeling. I spent the rest of the night sitting on the couch, every light in the apartment on. I tried distracting myself, turning on the TV, scrolling through my phone, but it was useless. I couldn't stop my mind from replaying everything. I kept glancing at the door, half expecting another knock. But hours passed, and nothing happened. Still, the unease lingered, a tension I couldn't explain. The next day, I decided I needed answers. I drove back to the forest, retracing my steps from that day. It felt reckless, I know, but I had to understand what was going on. I parked in the same spot and started walking, following the trail exactly as I had before. But this time, the unmarked path was gone. It was like the forest had swallowed it up, leaving no trace behind. I wandered for hours, combing the area, hoping to find something, a clue, a sign, anything that proved I wasn't losing my mind. But the trees stood still, unmoving, indifferent. No cabin, no footprints, nothing. I shouted into the woods, frustration boiling over, but only my own echo came back. It was like the forest was mocking me, hiding its secrets just out of reach. Defeated, I turned back, feeling the weight of unanswered questions pressing down on me. As I reached my car, I noticed something. On the passenger seat, there was a small book. The cover was old, the pages yellowed and brittle. I hadn't left it there. My hands felt cold as I picked it up, flipping through the pages. They were filled with symbols, the same ones I'd seen in the cabin. I dropped the book, stepping back, my mind racing. How had it gotten there? I grabbed the book, threw it in the trunk, and drove home as fast as I could. My thoughts were a mess. and every shadow on the road seemed to shift, like the forest was watching me leave. When I got home, I locked the door, pulling the curtains shut. The apartment felt different, less safe, like whatever was out there had followed me back again. I sat down, staring at the book on the table. It felt like a warning, a reminder that the forest hadn't let go of me yet. And as much as I wanted to get rid of it, some part of me needed to know what was inside. I stared at the book, heart racing as I turned the brittle pages. Strange symbols filled every inch, and some were familiar, reminding me of the drawings I'd seen in the cabin. They were not just random scribbles. They felt intentional, deliberate. My hands trembled as I tried to focus, and I wondered if this was a mistake. Was I inviting trouble by seeking answers? But I needed to understand what had happened, what had been following me. The writing was in a language I couldn't recognize, but there were diagrams that looked like maps. My eyes darted across the pages, searching for any clue that could shed light on the mysteries of that day. A chill ran down my spine. It was as if the book was alive, breathing a dark energy into my home. I shut it tightly and paced around the room, battling with myself. "Just put it away," I muttered. "Forget about it." But the words felt hollow. I could already hear the whispers of curiosity creeping in. It was as if the forest still had its grip on me, pulling me back into its depths. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my racing heart. What could it hurt? I thought. I'll just take a quick look. With a determined exhale, I sat back down and opened the book again. This time, I forced myself to pay attention to the symbols, tracing them with my finger. Some looked like markings I'd seen on ancient structures in documentaries. Was this some sort of ritual? I shuddered at the thought, images of hidden cults and dark ceremonies flashing through my mind. This was starting to feel less like curiosity and more like a dangerous obsession. Then, something caught my eye, a crude drawing of a cabin that looked strikingly similar to the one I'd stumbled upon. It was surrounded by ominous figures. My heart raced. What did that mean? Had someone else experienced something like I did? I flipped the page frantically, searching for more details, hoping for an explanation. Instead, I found more symbols and another illustration that made my blood run cold. The next drawing was of a person standing at a door, looking out into the woods. Their face was twisted in terror. I closed my eyes, trying to shake the image away, but it clung to me like a dark cloud. "This can't be real," I whispered. "It's just a coincidence." Yet deep down, I could feel the truth gnawing at me. I could sense that whatever happened that day was more than a random occurrence. I stood up, pacing again. "I'm done with this," I said out loud, trying to convince myself. But my hands wouldn't obey. They reached for the book, flipping to the back cover, where I noticed a name scrawled in faded ink. M. Davidson. The name rang a bell. I recalled a conversation with a friend who mentioned an old tale about a local family that had vanished in the woods. Could this be connected? A sense of dread washed over me. I grabbed my phone, searching for anything related to that name. My hands shook as I scrolled through the search results. I found a couple of links discussing the mysterious disappearances in the area, all linked to the forest and that fabled cabin. As I read, a cold sweat broke out on my forehead. The stories felt eerily similar to my experience. Panic gripped me as I realized I had stumbled into something far beyond a simple hike. This was a web of history, fear, and loss. I needed to know more. Who was M. Davidson? What happened to them? It felt like the forest was inviting me back, promising answers, yet warning me of the dangers that lay ahead. As the sun dipped below the horizon, shadows crept into my apartment. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, not just from the outside, but from the pages of that cursed book. I looked at it one last time, the urge to dive deeper clawing at me. I wasn't ready to face what I might find, but I also knew I couldn't turn away. The forest had a hold on me, and the secrets it kept were far from over. That night, I barely slept. Every creak of my apartment felt amplified, echoing like footsteps in the dark. I tossed and turned, consumed by thoughts of that book and the stories it held. It was as if the words were seeping into my mind, weaving a web of dread that kept me awake. Why am I doing this? I whispered to myself, hoping to find comfort in the quiet. Yet deep down, I knew I was drawn to the mystery, unable to resist its pull. By morning, I decided to delve deeper into the legend surrounding M. Davidson. I grabbed my laptop, hoping the glow of the screen would chase away the shadows. I found a few local news articles detailing the strange occurrences in the forest over the years. People reported feeling watched, hearing voices that seemed to come from nowhere. Others spoke of bizarre figures lurking between the trees. I clicked through, each click feeding my anxiety and curiosity. Maybe I should just leave it alone, I thought. Just because some people had weird experiences doesn't mean I will. But those thoughts quickly faded. I could still feel the cabin's presence in my mind, like a stubborn stain that wouldn't wash away. My fingers moved instinctively, searching for more information. I needed to know what I was dealing with. After hours of digging, I stumbled upon an old forum dedicated to the peculiar happenings in Pisgah National Forest. There, I found first-hand accounts, many eerily similar to mine. One post described a hiker who also discovered a cabin, only to find it empty, just like I had. But their experience didn't end there. They claimed to have encountered a figure outside, a shadow that seemed to watch their every move. My stomach twisted at the thought. Then, I found a comment that caught my eye. "Don't go back there," it read. "You'll never know what's waiting for you." It sent a chill down my spine, resonating with the unease I had felt after my visit. But instead of deterring me, it fueled my determination. I had to confront this head-on. Ignoring the advice would be too easy, and I was never one to shy away from a challenge. As I prepared to return to the forest, I packed essentials: water, snacks, and of course, the cursed book. I thought it might hold the key to understanding what had happened. My heart raced as I drove back, a mix of excitement and fear coursing through me. I tried to shake off the sensation that I was walking into a trap, but the thrill of the unknown overshadowed my concerns. When I finally arrived, the forest seemed different. The trees loomed taller, shadows deepened, and the air felt electric. I stood at the edge of the trail, hesitant. "This is just a hike," I told myself, but my instincts screamed otherwise. I forced my feet to move, retracing my steps to that same cabin. Each crunch of leaves beneath my boots sounded like a warning. Upon reaching the clearing, my heart sank. The cabin was gone, as if it had never existed. I stood there, disbelief washing over me. How could this be? Just days ago, it stood so solidly, a beacon of intrigue and fear. I searched the area frantically, hoping for a sign that it had simply shifted in the woods. But all I found were twisted roots and an unsettling quiet. Then, I noticed something on the ground, a deep impression in the earth, almost like a boot print. I knelt down to examine it closely, and my breath hitched. The print was fresh, muddy, and unmistakably human. My mind raced with questions. Who had been here? Was I being watched again? Suddenly, the forest felt alive, each rustle in the underbrush sending waves of paranoia coursing through me. Just as I stood up, a sound echoed from behind me, soft but unmistakable, like footsteps crunching on leaves. My heart hammered in my chest. "Hello?" I called out, voice trembling. No response. I turned slowly, scanning the trees, but only shadows greeted me. I felt the weight of unseen eyes upon me, piercing through the foliage. A sense of urgency surged within me. I had to leave. As I made my way back to the car, the eerie feeling of being followed returned. The trees seemed to close in around me, branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. I could hear my own breath quickening, panic rising as I picked up my pace. Just as I reached the edge of the forest, I glanced back one last time, and that's when I saw it, a figure standing in the distance, partially obscured by the trees. I froze, unable to comprehend what I was seeing. The figure looked eerily familiar, yet distorted, like a reflection in a broken mirror. My heart sank, and everything I had felt came rushing back. The forest had marked me, and it was not done. As I stumbled to my car, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just stepped into a story far darker than I ever anticipated, a tale that was only beginning. It was 2018 when I first stepped into the Pine Barrens, a sprawling wilderness in New Jersey that I had heard so much about. As a biology student at Rutgers University, I was excited to collect samples for my research project. I'd read countless tales about this place, woven into the fabric of local lore, ghost stories, strange disappearances, and cult rituals. I had always dismissed them as mere myths, but there was an eerie thrill in being surrounded by those ancient trees, thick with secrets. The sun had dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the uneven ground as I set up my equipment. My heart raced with anticipation. I was in my element, immersed in the natural world. The air was cool and crisp, a welcome contrast to the warmth of the day. I moved carefully, collecting soil and plant samples, jotting down observations in my notebook. I was focused, my mind in a scientific trance, but the stillness of the forest began to weigh on me. As I worked, faint sounds drifted through the trees. At first, I thought it was just the wind rustling the leaves, but the notes were distinct, almost melodic. I paused, straining to listen. There it was again, a haunting chant, rising and falling like a lullaby sung by distant voices. I shook my head, convincing myself it was all in my imagination, the product of an overactive mind. Yet, the longer I listened, the more I felt compelled to discover the source. Curiosity pushed me forward. I stepped away from my equipment, leaving my samples momentarily behind. The chanting grew louder as I moved deeper into the woods, each footfall muffled by the carpet of leaves. My heart raced with a mix of excitement and apprehension. I reminded myself that I was a scientist, rational and grounded. But the atmosphere shifted. It was as if the very trees were alive, watching me, waiting for something to happen. After what felt like an eternity, I stumbled upon a clearing. My breath caught in my throat. There, amidst the shadows, lay a circle of stones, intricately arranged, covered in strange symbols I couldn't decipher. In the center, a small fire flickered with an unnatural blue flame, casting an otherworldly glow. The chant had reached a crescendo, echoing in my ears, blending with the crackling of the fire. I felt a chill race down my spine, urging me to flee, yet I remained rooted to the spot. Suddenly, figures began to emerge from the trees, cloaked and silent, their faces obscured by hoods. They formed a semicircle around the fire, their movements precise and deliberate. I felt a knot form in my stomach as I realized I had stumbled upon something far beyond my understanding. A ritual, perhaps? My instincts screamed at me to run, but I was frozen, caught between fear and fascination. As the chanting intensified, one of the hooded figures turned sharply in my direction. It was as if they sensed my presence, despite the distance between us. Panic surged through me, breaking the spell. I turned on my heel and sprinted back toward my car, the sounds of my footsteps drowned out by the rhythm of my racing heart. I could hear their movements behind me, though when I glanced back, the figures had vanished into the darkness. When I finally reached my vehicle, I fumbled with the keys, my hands trembling. I couldn't shake the feeling of being hunted, that unseen eyes were watching me. I drove away, heart pounding, trying to rationalize what had just happened. The university was the first place I reported my experience, expecting disbelief or laughter. Instead, I was met with concern. Never go back there alone, my professor warned. Those woods hold secrets that shouldn't be disturbed. The days that followed were a blur of restless nights. I found myself plagued by nightmares of the cloaked figures, the haunting chants echoing in my mind. Even during daylight, the whispers seemed to linger, a constant reminder of what I had witnessed. I had walked into the Pine Barrens as a skeptic, but now I was ensnared in a web of uncertainty. I had crossed a line, and something deep inside me knew it wasn't over. Weeks passed after that night in the Pine Barrens, but I couldn't shake the memory of what I had seen. The chanting echoed in my mind, haunting my thoughts like a forgotten tune that refuses to leave. Each night was a battle, sleep evading me as I replayed the figures and their bizarre ritual. I tried to immerse myself in my studies, but the woods lingered at the edge of my consciousness, like a shadow that wouldn't fade. I knew I had to push through. I was a dedicated student after all. One evening, I sat in the campus library, surrounded by textbooks and the murmurs of fellow students. My friend Sarah plopped down next to me, her usual bright smile dimmed by concern. "Emily, you look like you've seen a ghost," she joked lightly, but I could tell she sensed my unease. I hesitated before sharing the details of my experience. "You won't believe what happened to me," I started, my voice trembling as I recounted my adventure in the woods. As I spoke, Sarah's expression shifted from amusement to disbelief. "You're telling me you stumbled upon a cult in the Pine Barrens?" That sounds like something out of a horror movie, she replied, her brow furrowed. I knew it sounded insane, but deep down, I felt that I wasn't alone in my fear. I remembered the way the figure had turned toward me, as if sensing my presence. I know it sounds crazy, but there was something unnatural about it, I insisted, hoping to convey the gravity of the situation. That night, I lay in bed, trying to ignore the creeping dread. My phone buzzed with a text from Sarah, asking if I wanted to go out the following weekend. I considered it briefly, wanting to distract myself, but a part of me remained anchored to the woods. The pull of the unknown was too strong, like a magnetic force I couldn't resist. I found myself scrolling through online forums about the Pine Barrens, reading ghost stories and accounts of strange occurrences. The more I read, the more I realized that I was not the first person to encounter something unsettling in those woods. As days turned into weeks, the nightmares continued. I dreamt of dark figures emerging from the shadows, their chants growing louder and more frantic. I would wake up gasping, my heart racing, and every time I looked at the clock, it was always 3 a.m., the witching hour. In those moments of fear, I wished I had never gone into the woods. I wanted to dismiss the fears as just a figment of my imagination, but the reality was too close. I decided to visit a local bookstore that specialized in folklore and legends. The air was thick with the smell of old paper and ink, a comforting scent that contrasted with the turmoil in my mind. I approached the counter, where an elderly man with a long beard looked up from his book. "Can I help you, dear?" he asked, his voice warm. I explained my interest in the Pine Barrens and the stories that surrounded it. He nodded knowingly and began to share tales of lost souls and forgotten rituals, drawing me into a world where reality and myth intertwined. I felt a chill as he spoke about the infamous Jersey Devil and the many strange disappearances linked to the area. "People go into those woods, and they don't always come back," he said, a hint of caution in his voice. His words stuck with me, feeding the anxiety that had become a constant companion. I left the store clutching a book about the history of the Pine Barrens, its pages filled with illustrations and eerie tales. I hoped that understanding the past might offer some clarity or peace. That weekend, I decided to confront my fears head-on. I would return to the Pine Barrens, but this time, I wouldn't go alone. I invited Sarah to join me, hoping that her presence would provide comfort. We packed snacks, flashlights, and the book I had bought, ready to explore the woods together. As we drove towards the familiar entrance, my heart raced with a mixture of excitement and dread. Would I find answers, or would I stumble deeper into the mystery? As we entered the forest, the sun hung low, casting elongated shadows across the path. The ambience was different with company. Sarah's laughter eased my tension, but beneath it, I felt an undercurrent of anxiety. I tried to stay focused, guiding us to the clearing where I had seen the circle of stones. We reached the spot just as the last rays of sunlight dipped below the horizon. It was eerily quiet, the kind of quiet that holds its breath, waiting. As I glanced around, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. The clearing looked just as I remembered it, but somehow it felt different, more alive perhaps. The stones stood solemnly in their circle, as if guarding secrets from ages past. I glanced at Sarah, who was busy snapping photos, unaware of the tension tightening in my chest. "This place is incredible," she said, her voice filled with excitement. I wanted to share in her enthusiasm, but a knot formed in my stomach. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were intruding on something we didn't fully understand. "Yeah, it's pretty wild," I replied, trying to sound casual. Inside, I was struggling to find the courage to speak the truth. I needed to warn her, but what if I sounded insane? Just then, the wind rustled the leaves, and a chill ran through me. My mind flashed back to that night of the chanting. The echo of their voices seemed to hang in the air, a haunting reminder of the danger lurking in the woods. I took a deep breath, attempting to steady myself. "We should stick together," I finally said. "I've heard stories about this place." Sarah raised an eyebrow, her interest piqued. "What kind of stories?" She put her camera down, giving me her full attention. I hesitated, recalling the elderly man's warning about the lost souls and rituals. "People say some strange things happen here. People vanish, or worse," I explained, watching her reaction closely. They say the woods have a way of drawing you in. My heart raced as I spoke. This wasn't just folklore. It was a part of me now, woven into my very being. She chuckled lightly, shaking her head. "You're not really serious, are you?" There was a playful glint in her eyes, but I could tell she was also intrigued. "I mean, it's just a story, right?" I nodded, but I couldn't shake the gravity of my experience. "Sometimes, stories have a way of becoming real," I replied softly, feeling a shiver of fear creep up my spine. The warmth of the setting sun was fading fast, casting eerie shadows across the ground. As the sky turned darker, we decided to investigate the symbols etched into the earth around the stones. I knelt down, tracing my fingers over the strange markings, feeling a peculiar energy pulsate beneath my touch. "What do you think these mean?" Sarah asked, peering closer. "Some sort of ancient language." I shook my head, uncertain. "I have no idea, but I think we should be careful. There's a reason why these markings are here." My voice wavered, the seriousness of the moment settling in. Suddenly, a faint sound reached my ears, an echo of distant chanting, a melody that sent chills down my arms. My breath hitched as I locked eyes with Sarah. "Do you hear that?" I whispered, my heart pounding in my chest. She nodded, her playful demeanor fading into something more serious. "What is that?" I couldn't answer, my mind racing back to that night when I first heard those haunting sounds. I stood up, my instincts screaming at me to leave. We both turned toward the direction of the noise, our breaths shallow. The air felt electric, charged with an unseen presence. "Emily, this isn't funny," Sarah said, a tremor in her voice. I wished it were a joke, but the chanting grew louder, pulling at my senses like a siren's call. I felt trapped, as if the woods were closing in around us. "We need to go," I urged, grabbing her arm. Just then, I caught a glimpse of movement at the edge of the trees, a shadow darting between the trunks. "Did you see that?" I gasped, my heart racing. Sarah followed my gaze, her eyes wide with fear. "What was that?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. My body felt frozen, torn between the urge to flee and the compulsion to investigate. "It could be an animal," I managed to say, but deep down, I knew it was something far more sinister. "We should just get back to the car." As I turned to lead the way, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of something lurking just beyond our sight. We hurried back along the path, but the chanting seemed to follow us, echoing through the trees. With each step, the ground felt more unsteady beneath me, and I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder. The shadows danced, twisting and turning in the fading light. Suddenly, the air shifted, and I felt a presence behind us. My instincts screamed for us to run, but my legs felt heavy, as if the forest itself was trying to keep us there. "Emily," Sarah cried, pulling me from my thoughts. "We have to hurry." I nodded, my pulse quickening. We picked up speed, adrenaline fueling our escape. But just as we reached the edge of the trees, I heard it. A voice, clear and melodic, cutting through the chaos. "Stay with us," it whispered, and a chill swept over me. We burst into the clearing, stumbling toward the car. I looked back one last time, and my breath caught. Figures were emerging from the shadows, cloaked and silent, their eyes fixed on us, watching as we fled. The drive back to the university felt like an eternity. I gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. Sarah was silent beside me, her face pale as she stared out the window. I could tell we were both lost in our thoughts, haunted by what we'd just witnessed. The trees seemed to loom closer as we sped past, their branches reaching out like fingers trying to pull us back. I wanted to shake off the unease, to convince myself that it was all just a figment of my imagination, but deep down I knew the truth. "What do you think we saw?" Sarah finally broke the silence. Her voice was barely above a whisper, tinged with disbelief. I glanced at her, the fear in her eyes mirroring my own. "I don't know," I admitted, but it felt real. Those figures, they were unlike anything I've ever seen. The memory of their dark cloaks and unwavering stares sent a shiver through me. It was almost like they were waiting for us. "Waiting for us," she echoed, incredulous. "Why would they want us?" I shook my head, grappling with the question that gnawed at me. "Maybe they wanted to keep us there," I said, my mind racing back to the chanting, the allure of that eerie melody. I felt drawn to them, like they were calling out. The thought made my stomach churn. But I also felt terrified. We shouldn't have been there. When we reached the campus, I parked the car and turned to Sarah, trying to shake off the unsettling feelings. "Let's just forget it happened. We can write it off as a weird adventure," I suggested, hoping to lighten the mood, but her expression didn't change. "It's not that easy, Emily," she said, her voice firm. "What if they're still out there? What if they come after us?" Her words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken fears. I took a deep breath, struggling to maintain my composure. "You're overthinking it. We got away, and that's what matters," I replied, but the tremor in my voice betrayed my certainty. I could still hear those haunting chants echoing in my mind, a relentless reminder that some doors should never be opened. We both climbed out of the car, but I couldn't shake the sensation of eyes watching us, even in broad daylight. As days turned into weeks, the nightmares began. Each night, I would toss and turn, drenched in sweat, the same vision replaying in my mind. I'd find myself back in the clearing, the figures surrounding me, their voices blending into an ominous song. I would wake up gasping, the chilling sensation of their presence lingering in my room. It felt like they were reaching out, trying to pull me back into that forest, and I couldn't escape. "Emily, you look terrible," Sarah remarked one morning at breakfast. I forced a smile, but inside, I felt like a ghost. "Just a rough night," I said, trying to brush off her concern. But I knew that my exhaustion came from more than just a lack of sleep. I couldn't share the details. How could I explain the weight pressing down on my chest, the way the chants still echoed in my ears? I thought about going to the university's counseling center, but a part of me hesitated. What if they dismissed my fears as mere stress? I was a biologist, after all. I dealt with data and facts, not shadows and whispers. Still, I couldn't shake the anxiety that clung to me like a second skin. I spent my days trying to focus on my research, but the woods haunted me. Each rustle of leaves outside felt like a reminder of what lurked beyond. One evening, I decided to return to the Pine Barrens, convinced I could confront my fears. I invited Sarah, hoping she would understand the urgency of my need for closure. "I can't keep living like this, Sarah. I need to know what happened," I confessed. She hesitated, her expression revealing the turmoil within her. "I'm not sure that's a good idea," she replied, concern etched on her face. "What if we run into them again?" But I was resolute. If we don't go back, I'll never be able to move on. It's like this weight is holding me down. Reluctantly, she agreed, and we set out one more time, armed with flashlights and an uneasy sense of purpose. The drive felt different this time, tense, charged with unspoken fears. As we approached the woods, the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch and twist in the fading light. With each step into the Pine Barrens, I felt the air grow heavier, a palpable tension surrounding us. I could hear the distant echoes of the chant, tugging at the corners of my mind. "Are you ready for this?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling slightly. I nodded, though doubt swirled in my chest. This was our chance to uncover the truth, but part of me feared what we might find. The deeper we ventured, the more the forest seemed to come alive, wrapping around us like a dark embrace. As we trekked deeper into the Pine Barrens, I felt a familiar unease creeping back in. Each crunch of leaves beneath our feet sounded amplified in the encroaching darkness. Sarah kept glancing at me, her eyes wide and uncertain. "Maybe this wasn't such a good idea after all," she finally said, her voice barely audible. I hesitated, but the pull of those haunting chants drove me forward. "We have to find out what's happening here," I replied, though I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. After what felt like an eternity, we stumbled upon the clearing where we had encountered the figures before. It looked almost the same, except the air felt charged, alive with an energy I couldn't comprehend. The stones were still arranged in that unnerving circle, and the symbols etched into the ground seemed to pulse under the moonlight. I could hear my heart racing, the rhythm matching the quickening pace of my breath. I had hoped this place would provide answers, but now I wasn't so sure. "Do you see that?" I whispered, pointing toward the center of the circle. A small fire flickered with an unnatural blue flame, casting eerie shadows on the ground. "It's just like before," Sarah said, her voice shaking. I stepped closer, feeling an invisible force beckoning me to come near. I could almost hear the whispers in my mind, urging me to uncover whatever secrets lay hidden within that circle. Stay back, Sarah, I warned, my instincts screaming at me to proceed with caution, but curiosity drowned out my fear. I stepped into the circle, the ground cold beneath my feet, and felt an overwhelming sensation wash over me. It was as if the fire was speaking, reaching out to me with its unusual glow. I could see faces forming in the flames, twisted, tortured expressions that made my blood run cold. "Emily!" Sarah shouted, but I couldn't pull myself away. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the shadows, cloaked and towering. I froze, heart pounding as it stepped into the light. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't obey. It raised its arms, and the chanting began anew, echoing around us, wrapping us in a thick blanket of fear. "They were waiting for you," it said, its voice chillingly calm. "You've been chosen." Chosen for what? I finally managed to shout back, the words tumbling from my lips before I could think, but the figure only smiled, a haunting grin that sent shivers down my spine. "To join us," it replied, gesturing to the fire, "to become one with the forest." In that moment, the realization hit me hard. The figures weren't just lurking in the shadows, they were a part of this place. They were its guardians, and I had stumbled into their domain. Sarah pulled at my arm, desperate to escape. "Emily, we need to go now," she cried, fear coloring her voice. But I couldn't tear my gaze away from the figure. I felt as though I was being pulled deeper into a trance. The whispers in my head grew louder, drowning out my thoughts. "You can't leave," it said, its voice like a caress. "Not now. Not ever." With one last surge of will, I turned to Sarah, and we bolted from the clearing, adrenaline propelling us forward. We ran through the trees, branches clawing at our clothes as we sprinted blindly through the darkness. I could hear footsteps behind us, quickening, following our every move. "They're coming!" I shouted, my heart racing even faster. I glanced back, but there was nothing there, just shadows playing tricks in the dim light. Finally, we broke free from the trees and stumbled into the open. Gasping for air, we reached the car. "Start it! Hurry!" I urged, fumbling with the keys. As the engine roared to life, I dared to glance back at the forest. It loomed behind us, dark and silent, but I could still feel its eyes watching. I wondered what had truly happened back there, what I had almost become a part of. As we drove away, the weight of our encounter settled heavily in my chest. I was relieved to escape, but an unsettling question remained. What if they didn't let me go so easily? Even now, I could still hear the echoes of the chanting in my mind, a reminder of the choice I had nearly made. In the weeks that followed, the nightmares returned, stronger than before. I thought I had escaped, but deep down, I feared the truth. Perhaps the forest had left a mark on me, a bond that could never be severed. I stood in my kitchen, the sunlight pouring in through the window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. I had just packed my gear for a weekend trip to Olympic National Park. As a photographer, capturing the raw beauty of nature has always been my passion, and there's no better backdrop than the dense forests and rugged mountains of Washington. I felt a thrill of excitement at the thought of spending 2 nights under the stars, surrounded by towering trees and the sounds of wildlife. After a long drive, I arrived at the park, greeted by the fresh scent of pine and the rustle of leaves in the breeze. The sky was a brilliant blue, and the sunlight filtered through the branches, casting playful shadows on the forest floor. I set up camp in a secluded spot, away from the hustle and bustle of more crowded areas. This was my sanctuary, a place where I could disconnect from the world and immerse myself in my craft. As night fell, I gathered around the campfire, the flames crackling and flickering in the darkness. I pulled out my camera to review the day's shots, reliving the beauty I had captured. But as I scrolled through the photos, something felt off. An uneasy feeling crept over me, like I was being watched. I glanced around, half expecting to see someone lurking in the shadows, but all I saw were trees swaying gently in the breeze. That's when I heard it, a soft, almost melodic whisper coming from the woods. It was faint at first, barely discernible above the sounds of the fire. Curiosity piqued. I leaned closer, straining to hear. The whisper grew louder, wrapping around me like a delicate thread, pulling me in. I couldn't resist the urge to follow the sound. It felt like the forest was beckoning me to explore its secrets. I ventured deeper into the trees, the light of my flashlight slicing through the darkness. The whispers seemed to guide my steps, weaving through the branches and leaves. It was disorienting, as if the trees themselves were trying to communicate. I stumbled upon a section of the forest where the trees were unnaturally spaced, arranged in a perfect circle. The sight sent a shiver down my spine. This wasn't just a random grouping of trees, it felt intentional. As I stood there, the whispers escalated into an almost urgent call. I felt a chill run through me. Was I alone out here? I turned to head back, but my heart sank when I stumbled upon a circle of stones partially hidden by foliage. Symbols were etched into the rock, ancient and foreign. What did they mean? An unsettling feeling gripped me. My instincts screamed that I shouldn't be there. The way back to my camp was shrouded in darkness, and the whispering seemed to shift, echoing through the trees, surrounding me. I hurried, glancing over my shoulder, convinced something was following. My pulse raced as the shadows seemed to dance just beyond the reach of my light. Panic clawed at me, urging me to move faster. Finally, I broke through the trees and spotted my campsite in the distance. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. When I reached my tent, I grabbed my camera to check my photos again. My stomach dropped as I realized that several images were missing. The remaining ones were distorted, shadows lurking just behind me in every frame. What had I captured? What had I seen? That night, sleep eluded me. I lay in my sleeping bag, the forest alive with sounds. The whispers lingered in my mind, and every rustle outside felt like a reminder of the unknown. I couldn't shake the feeling that the forest was hiding something that had been watching, waiting. As dawn broke, I made the decision to leave, feeling a mix of fear and curiosity. But as I packed my gear, I knew this story was far from over. The next morning, I awoke with a lingering sense of dread. The sunlight filtered through the tent fabric, casting striped shadows on my face. I tried to shake off the unsettling events of the night before, convincing myself it was just my imagination running wild. After all, who wouldn't feel a bit on edge after wandering through the woods in the dark? I rolled up my sleeping bag, determined to focus on the day ahead. I made a cup of coffee, savoring the warmth as I watched the mist rise from the forest floor. It was beautiful out here, but that beauty felt tainted now. I couldn't help but replay the whispers in my mind. Had I really heard them? Or was it just the wind playing tricks on me? I grabbed my camera and stepped outside, eager to immerse myself in the sights and sounds of nature, hoping to capture something magical to drown out the fear. As I wandered along the trails, the eerie feeling nagged at me. The trees towered above, their branches forming a dense canopy, blocking out much of the daylight. It felt like a completely different world out here, removed from civilization. I stopped to take photos of a deer grazing nearby, but as I framed the shot, I noticed the animal's head perk up suddenly. Its ears twitched, as if it heard something I couldn't. In that moment, a chill trickled down my spine. What was it sensing that I couldn't? I continued down the path, attempting to shake off the tension. Every rustle in the underbrush made me jump. Every branch snapping underfoot sounded deafening. I stopped to examine some interesting foliage, trying to lose myself in the beauty of the forest. Yet the deeper I went, the more pronounced the whispers became. They seemed to beckon me, calling from just beyond my line of sight. I felt torn between my curiosity and an instinct to retreat. Then, I reached the clearing where I had seen the strange arrangement of trees the night before. The circle of stones still stood, and I felt an inexplicable urge to get closer. My heart raced as I crouched down, inspecting the symbols carved into the stones. I had seen similar markings in documentaries about ancient cultures and their rituals, but these felt different, more sinister. What were they doing here? I murmured to myself, but no answer came. As I stood up, the wind picked up, rustling the leaves overhead. I swear I heard my name whispered in the wind. David. The sound was unmistakable, chilling me to the core. My breath hitched in my throat as I spun around, looking for any sign of life. But I was alone, or so I thought. The forest felt alive, and I could feel the weight of its presence pressing against me. I decided to head back to camp, my feet moving faster than I intended. I was overwhelmed by a sense of urgency. As I retraced my steps, I glanced back toward the clearing, and for a split second, I thought I saw a figure among the trees. It was gone in an instant, but my heart raced at the thought. What if I wasn't alone? The thought consumed me, fueling my panic. Once I reached my tent, I couldn't shake the feeling of being followed. I quickly packed my things, my hands trembling as I shoved my camera into my bag. I had to leave, but as I looked through the lens one last time, I froze. In every photo from the past 2 days, there was that same shadow lurking behind me, just out of focus but ever present. It seemed to mock my fear, taunting me with its darkness. I threw my bag over my shoulder and stumbled out of the tent. The whispers rose again, swirling around me like a tempest. I felt their pull, their insistence to stay, to discover what lay hidden beneath the surface of the woods. But my instincts screamed at me to escape. With each step toward the trailhead, I could almost hear the forest laughing, a haunting reminder that some secrets are better left undisturbed. I barely slept that night. My mind kept racing back to those photos, the strange symbols, and the feeling that I was being watched. Every creak of the tent made my heart skip a beat. It was as if the very fabric of the forest had come alive, whispering secrets I wasn't meant to hear. I could almost hear the trees laughing at my naivete for thinking I could capture nature's beauty without consequence. Morning couldn't come soon enough, yet I felt dread tightening its grip on me. When dawn finally broke, I forced myself to crawl out of the tent, hoping to find clarity in the sunlight. I poured a cup of coffee, staring out at the expanse of trees that surrounded me. They seemed different in the light, their towering forms casting long shadows across the ground. It felt surreal, as if the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I made my way to the clearing again, determined to find an explanation for what I had experienced. As I stepped into the clearing, a chill ran through me. The stones remained unchanged, and I felt drawn to the markings. They had a familiar quality, almost like a language I couldn't understand. I knelt down, tracing my fingers over the grooves, feeling an odd connection to them. "What did you mean to say?" I whispered, half hoping for a response. It was absurd, but in that moment I wished the forest would reveal its secrets, the way it had done for countless generations of explorers. Suddenly, the whispering returned, louder than before. It felt like a call, an urgent message from deep within the woods. I glanced around, searching for the source, my breath quickening as anxiety began to bubble up. This is ridiculous, I told myself, but the words felt hollow. The energy in the air shifted. The feeling of being watched intensified. I stood up abruptly, deciding it was time to leave. My gut told me I was treading on dangerous ground. Back at my campsite, I grabbed my camera, hoping to document my thoughts through pictures. I needed to capture this moment, to hold on to something tangible as proof of what I had experienced. With each click of the shutter, I felt a growing unease, as if the camera itself had become a conduit for something darker. When I reviewed the images, I was stunned. Each one revealed that same shadow lurking just out of sight, always in the periphery, like a secret I wasn't meant to uncover. Frustrated, I decided to take a hike further into the park, thinking distance might bring some peace. The trail twisted and turned, leading me deeper into the woods. I focused on the rhythm of my feet, the crunch of leaves beneath me, trying to drown out the whispers. Yet, the sensation of being followed only grew stronger. I glanced over my shoulder frequently, half expecting to see someone or something waiting behind me, but only the trees stared back. After a while, I stumbled upon an old wooden signpost, weathered and half hidden by ferns. It read, "Beware of the shadows." My heart raced. What did that mean? I had seen countless signs in parks warning about wildlife or safety, but this one felt ominous. Who had put it there? The locals. The whispers seemed to swell again, as if echoing my fear. "You shouldn't be here, David." They seemed to murmur, taunting my very presence in this place. As I stood frozen, grappling with the weight of that sign, a rustle nearby pulled my attention. I turned sharply, and my pulse quickened. There, emerging from the thicket, was a figure. I squinted, trying to make out the details. It was hard to tell in the dappled light. I called out, "Hello?" My voice sounded weak against the backdrop of the forest. No response came, just the continued whispering, louder now, as if the trees themselves were warning me to run. Without thinking, I turned and dashed back the way I came, fear propelling me forward. I couldn't shake the feeling of being pursued, that presence lingering just behind me. The trail blurred, and panic clouded my thoughts. I reached my campsite in record time, nearly tripping over roots and rocks. I slammed my tent flaps shut, heart racing, and took a moment to gather my thoughts. But I was not alone. The shadows seemed to converge, pressing in around me. I sat in the tent, my heart pounding against my chest, the shadows feeling almost sentient around me. The weight of the unknown pressed heavily, and I couldn't shake the idea that something was out there, watching. Each rustle outside made me jump. It was maddening. I wanted to scream, to demand whatever was lurking to reveal itself, but the primal part of me knew better. "Stay quiet, David," I thought. "Don't give them a reason." I clutched my camera tightly, as if it could somehow shield me from the darkness. Desperately, I turned my attention to my phone. I had service, at least. A part of me hoped to find comfort in sharing my story, but the other half was afraid. What would I even say? "Hey guys, just chilling in the woods, feeling haunted?" I opened a forum I frequented, typing out the bizarre occurrences of the last 2 days. The moment I hit send, a chill raced down my spine. What if someone out there knew too much? What if they were already aware of the whispers, of the shadows? As I waited for a response, I glanced at the entrance of the tent, half expecting to see a face peering back at me. I imagined the worst, figures moving just out of sight, their intentions veiled in darkness. "Focus on the images," I told myself. I scrolled through the photos again, trying to decipher what lay hidden within those frames. Each time I looked, the shadows appeared more pronounced, almost as if they were creeping closer. I felt an urgency to understand, yet fear paralyzed me. Suddenly, my phone buzzed, and I nearly dropped it. A response. "You're not alone," it read. "Happened to me last summer at the same park. Those whispers are real. You must leave now." My hands trembled as I read it again. The weight of those words sank in. If someone else had experienced this, what had they faced? Panic ignited in me. I couldn't just sit here. I needed to act. I peered out of the tent flap, half expecting the worst, but the forest looked deceptively calm. "It's just trees," I whispered to myself, trying to rationalize my fear. Yet, even as I said it, I couldn't shake the feeling that the trees were more than mere wood and bark. The air felt electric, charged with something ancient and ominous. "Okay, maybe a walk to clear my head," I decided, grabbing my flashlight. I needed to be brave, to reclaim my experience. Once outside, I turned on my flashlight, the beam slicing through the darkness. I followed the path that led deeper into the woods. Each step echoed, yet the whispers in the trees returned, swirling around me. "I'm not afraid," I said, trying to convince myself. "You can do this." But the deeper I went, the less sure I felt. The shadows danced at the corners of my vision, taunting me. Ahead, I spotted a clearing, bathed in a ghostly light that seemed to emanate from nowhere. "What is this?" I thought, heart racing. As I stepped into the space, I froze. The ground was littered with stones, each etched with markings that looked eerily similar to what I had seen earlier. My pulse quickened. "This isn't right," I mumbled under my breath, overwhelmed by a sense of dread. In that moment, the whispers intensified, almost forming words that brushed against my ears. I strained to listen, desperate to decipher their meaning. "David," they seemed to call, "come closer." The invitation was both alluring and terrifying. Against my better judgment, I moved toward the center of the clearing. What lay before me felt like a portal into a world I didn't understand, a place where reality blended with something far more sinister. But then a noise interrupted my thoughts, a snap of a twig behind me. I whipped around, fear coursing through me. Nothing, just darkness, consuming the space. I wanted to run, to escape the unseen presence, but my feet felt glued to the ground. Something about the clearing held me captive. The whispers urged me on, coaxing me closer to the edge of a nightmare I couldn't yet comprehend. I stood in the clearing, the markings on the stones glowing softly under the beam of my flashlight. A strange pull came from the center, as if the symbols were alive, drawing me in. "What do you want from me?" I whispered, half hoping for an answer. I felt my heart pounding in my ears. There was an urgency in the air, a feeling that I was on the brink of something monumental. I took a hesitant step forward, barely aware of the world around me. As I stepped closer, the shadows shifted, almost as if they were alive, dancing between the trees. I couldn't shake the thought that I was being watched. I glanced back at the path I had taken. It seemed to disappear into darkness, an invitation to turn around. But that wasn't why I had come. I wanted answers. I'm not afraid, I told myself, but even I could hear the uncertainty in my voice. Suddenly, a voice pierced the air. David. It was soft yet commanding, resonating deep within me. I spun around, eyes wide, searching for the source. There was nothing. This is insane, I muttered, but I knew it wasn't just my imagination. I could feel it, the presence, the intensity of the moment. It was as if the trees themselves were holding their breath, waiting for me to take the next step. I focused on the symbols again, my curiosity overpowering my fear. What did they mean? I knelt down, tracing my fingers along the markings, feeling a strange warmth beneath my touch. They seemed to pulse, responding to my presence. What are you trying to show me? I breathed. In that instant, a flash of images raced through my mind, visions of people, shadows, and pain. It felt like a warning, yet I was mesmerized. Then, out of nowhere, I heard it again. Those whispers, louder this time, swirling around me like a storm. Leave while you still can. Panic gripped me. My instincts screamed to flee, but I was frozen, paralyzed by the weight of what I was witnessing. I was no longer just a photographer. I was a participant in something I didn't understand. The stones seemed to pulse with energy, connecting me to the very essence of the forest. Please, I called out, desperation in my voice, show me what you want. In that moment, everything changed. The ground beneath me trembled, and a figure emerged from the shadows, a dark silhouette, tall and imposing, standing just beyond the edge of the light. My breath caught in my throat as it stepped closer, revealing eyes that glowed with an unnatural light. You have disturbed our peace, it spoke, its voice echoing through the trees. You must pay the price. A chill ran through me as the realization struck. I was not just an observer. I had awakened something ancient and powerful. The camera in my hand suddenly felt heavy, like a burden I couldn't bear. What do you want from me? I pleaded, feeling small and insignificant. The figure tilted its head and I saw a flicker of recognition in its eyes. Your fear feeds us. Your memories belong to us now. I stumbled backward, struggling to grasp what was happening. The symbols on the stones flared brightly, and I could see glimpses of my own past flashing before me, moments of regret, fear, and sorrow. It was as if my life was being laid bare for this entity to consume. No, this can't be real, I shouted, but deep down, I knew the truth. The figure stepped closer, its presence overwhelming. You are not the first to come here, it whispered, and you won't be the last. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. This wasn't just a legend, it was a cycle, a trap that lured in the curious and devoured their essence. With a surge of adrenaline, I turned to run, my instincts kicking in. But the forest shifted, branches reaching out to block my path. As I stumbled through the trees, I could hear the whispers closing in, a cacophony of voices. Join us, David, join us. They echoed in my mind, pulling me back, and I felt the weight of despair dragging me down. I pushed harder, adrenaline surging through me, desperate to escape. But even as I ran, I felt their gaze on me, their hunger lingering in the air, and I knew that this encounter would haunt me forever. I made it back to my tent, heart racing, breaths ragged. The camera fell from my hands, hitting the ground with a thud. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had left a piece of myself in that clearing. As I packed my gear, I glanced at the photos I had taken. But when I scrolled through, I froze. The images showed not only the forest, but also a shadow lingering in the corners, a reminder that some places hold on to their secrets, and I had been foolish enough to look.